It began with a flicker on the radar screens, so brief, so thin, that RAF operators first assumed it was interference drifting across the morning haze. Yet within minutes, aircrews returning from reconnaissance confirmed the impossible. A twin-engine aircraft, pale as unvarnished timber, had passed them at a speed no known bomber could reach. It flew as if carried by its own silence, leaving behind only the unsettled memory of something that should not have been able to exist. As rumors crossed the channel, Berlin dismissed them as another English exaggeration. But the whispers persisted. Pilots spoke of a machine made not of metal, but of laminated wood, slipping through the sky faster than Germany's finest fighters. In the corridors of the Reich Air Ministry, the idea seemed almost insulting, an empire forged on steel being challenged by carpentry. Yet the reports continued to pile up, each one chipping away at certainty. When the file finally landed on Hermann Göring's desk, irritation gave way to an unease he could not fully conceal. If the numbers were accurate, speed, climb rate, altitude, then something in the Reich's assumptions had fractured. For years, Germany believed itself unmatched in engineering. Now a wooden craft threatened to humiliate that belief in full daylight. The proof came on a morning raid that struck with surgical clarity. A formation of mosquitoes swept across northern Germany, dropped their bombs with indifferent precision, and vanished before the first interceptors could claw their way into the sky. Not a single mosquito was lost. The Luftwaffe was left grasping at contrails that dissolved faster than their response. Commanders scrambled for explanations. Their fastest fighters were too slow, their doctrine too rigid, their pride suddenly exposed. The mosquito had rewritten the geometry of pursuit before Germany understood the problem. In the Air Ministry, engineers were ordered to study every scrap of intelligence on the new intruder. Yet beneath the technical questions lay an older, quieter one. How could the world's most industrialized war machine be outpaced by craftsmen working with spruce, plywood, and casein glue? And as officials argued over solutions, they overlooked a far more unsettling truth. The mosquito had only just begun to show what wood could do. Germany's aviation empire had been built on metal, on duralumin frames, precision machining, and the belief that progress always required greater complexity. In the factories of Augsburg and Bremen, engineers treated wood as a material belonging to another century, something suited for furniture, not frontline warfare. Yet as reports of the mosquito circulated through the Reich, this quiet assumption began to tremble. The idea that plywood could outrun the Reich's most celebrated fighters seemed almost impolite, as if the laws of engineering had shifted without asking permission. For Hermann Göring, the insult cut deeper than the threat. He had spent years proclaiming that German industry produced the finest aircraft in the world. Now a British bomber, built largely by carpenters, had shattered that certainty. In public, he condemned the mosquito as propaganda, a misidentified aircraft, an exaggeration. But in the privacy of the Reich Air Ministry, he demanded immediate analysis. Pride had been wounded, and beneath the bravado, a quieter fear surfaced. Germany might be losing its technological command of the sky. Across the channel, British planners revealed their intent with a calm that belied the storm they were about to unleash. Rather than armor, they chose speed. Rather than complexity, they chose elegance. The mosquito's purpose was not to withstand enemy fire, but to avoid it entirely. In the calculus of war, mass mattered less than motion. It was a philosophy Germany had never considered, a bomber that lived by outrunning the very threat designed to destroy it. As 1942 unfolded, the Luftwaffe's early war dominance began to crumble. Allied factories surged to full output, producing machines faster than Germany could replace its losses. Air superiority, once a German expectation, became a fragile memory. And with every daylight mosquito raid that returned untouched, that memory faded further. Inside design bureaus, German engineers pored over scraps of intelligence, attempting to understand how plywood, layered, bonded, and shaped, could defeat Messerschmitts and Focke-Wulfs forged from steel. The answer eluded them not because the materials were mysterious, but because the concept itself contradicted their doctrine. Allied intelligence saw the confusion first, intercepted it, and quietly amplified it. Doubt traveled faster than any aircraft. Soon, German officers began to wonder what else Britain had built, and what other wooden phantoms might be waiting beyond the horizon. And as that uncertainty deepened, a new question emerged, one that would define the coming months. If a plywood bomber could devastate German confidence, what would happen when its true potential was finally unleashed? The moment Göring uttered the words, they echoed through the Reich with a sting no enemy bomb could match. I turn green with envy. The British have this wooden aircraft. What began as a burst of frustration revealed far more than he intended. Beneath the bluster lay a grudging admiration, and beneath that, a fear Germany had never confronted. The realization that innovation could arrive not through heavier armor or larger engines, but through lightness, simplicity, and clarity of purpose. In that single admission, the Reich's strategic blind spot was exposed. For years, German aviation doctrine equated strength with weight, protection with metal. Yet the Mosquito defied those convictions with unnerving elegance. Its raids on Gestapo headquarters in Aarhus and later Copenhagen demonstrated a precision that seemed almost personal. The aircraft struck without pause, weaving through flak with the crisp confidence of a machine perfectly matched to its mission. When the smoke cleared, the destruction was surgical, the losses minimal, and the message unmistakable. Britain had mastered a new philosophy of air power. Across occupied Europe, civilians whispered about a ghost plane, a machine so fast and so silent it appeared and vanished before the air raid sirens finished sounding. Many refused to believe it was made of wood. Others claimed it was invisible to radar, a misunderstanding born from the truth that German operators often failed to track it at all. The Mosquito crossed their screens as a faint, momentary pulse, there, then gone, like a heartbeat skipping under stress. Inside Luftwaffe control rooms, the frustration grew sharper. Radar officers confessed that the Mosquito's narrow silhouette and wooden frame blended into atmospheric clutter. By the time they confirmed a contact, the aircraft was already departing the target. Interception became less a tactic than a futile gesture. Panic crept through the corridors of the Air Ministry as the implications settled in. If Britain had built one such aircraft, what prevented them from building a dozen more? What if this was merely the first expression of a wider shift in Allied engineering? And so, shock hardened into determination. Germany vowed to replicate the Mosquito, to reclaim parity by imitating the very weapon that had humiliated them. Yet as their engineers set to work, they would soon discover that copying genius is far more difficult than recognizing it, especially when the next Allied breakthrough was already taking shape beyond their sight. Göring's frustration soon hardened into command. If Britain could craft a wooden miracle, then Germany would build one to eclipse it. He summoned his designers and demanded an aircraft that matched the Mosquito in speed and surpassed it in lethality. The order carried the weight of wounded pride. A Reich that had mocked British carpentry now needed its own wooden savior. What began as a reaction to humiliation quickly became a national directive, an effort not merely to counter the Mosquito, but to reclaim the technological prestige slipping from Germany's grasp. Out of this urgency emerged the proposal for a new night fighter, the Focke-Wulf Ta-154. It would be built largely of wood, powered by twin Jumo 211 engines, and shaped for interception missions against the very bombers Germany could no longer reliably challenge. Engineers called it the Mosquito, in a deliberate echo of its British counterpart, a linguistic admission of both respect and rivalry. Early sketches promised a sleek airframe, minimal drag, and the potential to reach speeds that might finally close the widening gap in the night skies over the Reich. Within the Air Ministry, early optimism spread with surprising speed. Here at last was a design that seemed to validate Germany's ability to adapt. The Ta-154 moved from paper to prototype with uncommon urgency, its assembly lines prepared even before testing was complete. Yet the haste concealed deeper problems: material shortages, fragmented supply chains, and a wartime industry already stretched thin by Allied pressure. The very conditions that made a wooden aircraft attractive also undermined the possibility of building it properly. The crisis worsened when Allied bombers destroyed the factory producing Tego film, the adhesive essential for binding the Ta-154's wooden components. In desperation, engineers turned to ersatz resins, substitutes created to keep production alive. But what these resins offered in availability, they lacked in stability. Fuselages warped, joints failed, and structural integrity wavered under stress. The aircraft intended to rival the Mosquito was being assembled on a foundation that could not bear the weight of its ambition. Yet when the first completed prototypes took to the air, they displayed flashes of remarkable potential. The Ta-154 was undeniably fast, agile in turns, and armed heavily enough to tee. Allied bombers, Test pilots praised its responsiveness, noting that with proper materials, it might genuinely challenge the Mosquito's dominance. For a moment, hope returned to the German high command, a belief that ingenuity might still overcome scarcity. Göring seized that moment. He hailed the Ta-154 as the Reich's long-awaited answer, declaring that Germany had matched British innovation stride for stride. His confidence crystallized into policy, pushing for mass production even as engineers warned that the adhesive issues remained unresolved. But wartime desperation often transforms belief into arrogance, and Germany convinced itself that sheer determination could compensate for dwindling resources. In those months, the Reich stood at the edge of a dangerous illusion, the belief that it could outpace a nation it had once dismissed, even as its industrial foundation crumbled beneath the pressure of a global war. And while German engineers struggled to imitate the Mosquito, they failed to see the next development forming across the Channel, an evolution that would render imitation irrelevant. When the Ta-154 entered development, it did not step into a unified system, but into a battlefield of competing ambitions. Within the Luftwaffe, the aircraft's greatest rival was not the Mosquito, but another German design, the Heinkel He-219. Each program drew lines of loyalty across the Air Ministry, and instead of clarity, the Reich found itself trapped in internal rivalry. In a war defined by diminishing resources, two night fighters became symbols of institutional pride, and the struggle between them drained energy Germany could no longer spare. The He-219 carried powerful advocates, commanders who favored its advanced radar suite, its heavy armament, and its promise as a dedicated night interceptor. The Ta-154, leaner and faster, appealed to those who saw in it a direct counter to the Mosquito's philosophy. Yet these arguments were rarely technical. They reflected the politics of influence, who controlled design bureaus, who secured materials, who maintained Göring's favor. With every meeting, the debate grew less about performance and more about prestige. Progress slowed under the weight of human ego. Göring's own biases amplified the turmoil. His long-standing resentment toward Heinkel, a company he believed received too much wartime recognition, skewed decision-making at the highest levels. Though the He-219 demonstrated impressive capabilities, Göring withheld full support, viewing it as a threat to his own authority rather than an asset to Germany's defense. His praise for the Ta-154, public, emphatic, and politically charged, forced the program forward even when engineering concerns demanded caution. Thus, the Reich's search for a Mosquito counterpart narrowed not through science, but through personal jealousy. Meanwhile, the German woodworking industry struggled to meet demands the British had mastered over years of preparation. Britain's investment in laminated structures predated the war. Their factories possessed the presses, molds, and chemical treatments needed to shape high-strength plywood with remarkable consistency. Germany, by contrast, lacked both the time and the specialized tooling. Skilled carpenters worked diligently, but wartime improvisation replaced the slow refinement that had given the Mosquito its strength. In a conflict where precision determined survival, the gap between craftsmanship and capacity became a widening fault line. The reliance on ersatz adhesives turned that fault line into catastrophe. After Allied raids destroyed the Tegofilm plant, the replacement resins introduced into Ta-154 production contained impurities that reacted unpredictably with the wood. Under stress, joints softened. Under vibration, they cracked. The sleek airframe, so promising in tests, became treacherous in practice. Crashes followed, first sporadic, then frequent, each one exposing the grim truth that no amount of aerodynamic elegance could compensate for a structure that could not hold itself together. Engineers examined the wreckage with a growing sense of dread. The failures were not merely defects, they were systemic, born from chemical instability that no field modification could solve. What had begun as a technical challenge now revealed itself as a fundamental impossibility. Even as designs matched or exceeded Mosquito dimensions, the essence of the aircraft remained out of reach. Germany had attempted to imitate form without the foundation that gave it life. In those quiet, somber evaluations, the realization settled. Copying the Mosquito required far more than stealing its measurements. It required time, materials, and a philosophy of innovation Germany had abandoned long before the first wooden phantom crossed its skies. And as this truth emerged from the debris, a far more urgent question began to rise. What would happen when Britain advanced beyond wood altogether? The war's pressure TIG H-10'd around Germany's industrial heartland with unrelenting force. Allied bombing raids, now coordinated with growing precision, struck not only aircraft plants, but the quieter, less obvious workshops that gave wooden airframes their strength. Adhesive factories, jig manufacturers, mold producers, facilities essential to the Ta-154's construction, fell under waves of high explosives. Each detonation erased a link in the chain required to sustain the program. What had once been a fragile project became, almost overnight, a wounded one, its supply lines fractured beyond easy repair. Within the Air Ministry, the failures of the Ta-154 prototypes reached Göring with increasing regularity. Yet his public demeanor remained unchanged, confident, dismissive, boastful. To the outside world, the wooden night fighter remained a symbol of German ingenuity preparing to strike back at the Allies. Privately, however, the reports unsettled him. His engineers could not keep the airframes intact under stress, and every test flight seemed to introduce a new weakness. The discrepancy between rhetoric and reality widened, until even Göring sensed the ground shifting beneath him. That shift became undeniable when another prototype broke apart in midair during a routine evaluation flight. Witnesses watched as the fuselage split along its centerline, scattering fragments across the forest below. The pilot, skilled and trusted, did not survive. His death froze the program in place. Engineers gathered around the wreckage with the grim silence of men confronting not just a technical failure, but a moral one. The speed they had promised could not compensate for a material foundation that betrayed them when pushed to its limits. In confidential discussions, scientists admitted what political leaders refused to hear. The British adhesives, casein fortified with carefully engineered synthetic resins, were beyond Germany's reach. They produced bonds that resisted vibration, heat, and moisture with a reliability impossible to match under wartime scarcity. Ersatz substitutes, born of necessity rather than design, introduced microscopic flaws that grew into catastrophic fractures. Every Ta-154 that took flight carried this vulnerability within its frame, hidden until the moment's strain revealed it. Production planners soon reached a similar conclusion. Even without adhesive shortages, Germany lacked the machinery required for large-scale wooden aircraft construction. The intricate laminations, the precision molds, the controlled curing environments, these were facilities Britain had refined over years of experimentation, while Germany attempted to improvise under bombardment. The Ta-154 was no longer just a challenging project. It was an industrial impossibility. Yet Göring, fearing political embarrassment more than technical defeat, suppressed the investigative reports. They remained locked in drawers, circulated only among a few trusted officers. To admit that Germany could not reproduce a British wooden design would undermine not only the Ta-154, but the myth of German engineering supremacy he had cultivated for years. Silence became policy, and optimism became a shield against inconvenient truth. But inside the Reich Air Ministry, faith in technological salvation had begun to fracture. Engineers no longer spoke of catching the mosquito. They spoke of surviving the next audit, the next inspection, the next impossible demand. The dream of a wooden countermeasure faded from ambition into resignation. And as that silence deepened, another realization approached. Britain had not paused its innovation simply because Germany had failed. The next evolution of Allied air power was already preparing to step into the sky. To understand why the Mosquito succeeded where its German counterpart faltered, one must leave the airfields and step into the workshops that shaped both aircraft. In Britain, the Mosquito was not the creation of a single factory, but a symphony of craftsmanship spread across the nation. Furniture makers carved wing ribs with the same steady hands that once shaped cabinetry. Boat builders assembled curved fuselage panels with instincts honed on rivercraft. Even violin craftsmen contributed, their mastery of fine laminations finding new purpose in wartime. This distributed network transformed civilian artistry into military strength. Each workshop became a quiet front in the conflict, a place where chisels, glues, and presses defended Britain as surely as any fighter squadron. Germany possessed no comparable reserve. Years of total war had drained its artisanal trades, pulling woodworkers, cabinet makers, and skilled craftsmen into the army or munitions plants. What remained of the tradition lacked the breadth and flexibility that Britain mobilized so effortlessly. Where the Mosquito thrived on decentralization, the Ta-154 struggled under an industrial model built for steel, not spruce. German factories engineered marvels of metal, but there. Wooden divisions were ad hoc, created too quickly, with too few specialists, and burdened by wartime scarcity. The contrast revealed a deeper truth. Innovation is not merely invention, but the environment that supports it. When German engineers studied the Mosquito's birch, balsa sandwich construction, they recognized its elegance but not its subtleties. To the eye, it was simple, layers of birch veneer surrounding a lightweight balsa core. Yet its strength came not only from the materials, but from the precise pressures, resins, curing times, and tolerances that de Havilland had refined through years of experimentation. Germany could reproduce the dimensions, but the deeper engineering, the quiet knowledge, the practiced touch, remained elusive. What emerged from German workshops resembled the Mosquito in shape, but not in character. The greatest obstacle lay in adhesives. A wooden aircraft relies on glue as much as any metal machine relies on rivets. German substitutes faced extremes of temperature and humidity inside high-speed airframes, conditions that revealed chemical weaknesses invisible during ground tests. Resins crystallized, joints delaminated, fuselage panels separated along microscopic fractures. In laboratories, samples performed adequately. In flight, they betrayed the aircraft. Even the best adhesives produced under wartime conditions lacked the consistency of Britain's carefully engineered compounds. What held the Mosquito together under sweeping maneuvers and violent turbulence simply could not be replicated under the weight of Allied bombing. Inside the Focke-Wulf design bureaus, innovation became a reflex born of urgency. Engineers redesigned critical joints, introduced metal reinforcements, and evaluated alternative woods, from pine to beech to locally sourced laminates. They modified the airframe to relieve stress points, altered curing methods, and developed new bonding geometries to compensate for unreliable glue. Each solution carried brilliance, testament to minds working at the edge of possibility. But each solution also added weight, complexity, or production delays. The Ta-154 slowly drifted from its intended purpose, a lightweight predator capable of matching the Mosquito's speed. Where the British design gained strength through simplicity, the German response accumulated burdens through necessity. The war shaped innovation unevenly between the two nations. In Britain, decentralization created resilience. If one workshop fell to bombing, dozens more could continue production. In Germany, centralization bred vulnerability. When a single adhesive plant was destroyed, the entire wooden aircraft program faltered. What Britain achieved through cooperation, Germany attempted through improvisation, and the gap widened with every passing month. Prototypes of the Ta-154 demonstrated flashes of promise, moments where the airframe seemed to fulfill its designer's hopes. But these successes were fragile. Test aircraft weighed more than intended. Reinforcements dulled performance. Glue lines, though improved, never achieved British reliability. Even if the design could have been perfected, mass production remained impossible. Germany lacked the dispersed network of craftsmen, the specialized machinery, and the industrial stability that gave the Mosquito its wings. By the time these truths settled into the minds of German engineers, the Mosquito had already expanded its role, from fast bomber to pathfinder, from reconnaissance platform to night fighter. The race no longer centered on imitation. It had shifted to survival in a sky increasingly shaped by Allied control. And as the Ta-154 struggled to escape the weight of its own compromises, Britain prepared to unveil aircraft whose innovations stretched beyond wood entirely, ushering in a new chapter that Germany was ever less equipped to meet. As the Ta-154 faltered, Germany refused to abandon the idea of a wooden miracle. A second wave of experimental designs emerged, projects conceived in haste, approved in optimism, and built under conditions that grew harsher by the week. Among these efforts stood the Junkers Ju-248, an aircraft envisioned as a swift, unconventional interceptor that might finally match the agility Britain achieved with the Mosquito. Other prototypes followed, each promised as the weapon that would restore balance to the night skies. Yet each carried the same unspoken burden. They were being born into a system already collapsing under its own weight. The Ju-248 and its sister projects promised much on paper. Engineers claimed unprecedented rate of climb, formidable speed, and the stability required to intercept Allied bombers at altitude. Wooden components would lighten the airframe and free scarce metals for other programs. But the gap between aspiration and reality widened quickly. In test bays and workshops, the same ghosts that haunted the Ta-154 returned, adhesives that cured unevenly, joints that warped under tension and fuse. Lage frames that twisted in ways no engineer could predict. The promise of mosquito-like performance remained an unreachable horizon. Glue failures became the quiet terror of every design team. Under simulated flight stress, wooden panels separated along their seams, leaving gaps where structural continuity should have been. Temperature variations caused bonds to crack. Humidity introduced warping that no jig could correct. The carefully layered laminates that formed the mosquito's elegant strength behaved like uncertain patchwork in German hands. Even when engineers reinforced joints with metal, the fundamental instability remained. A single flaw hidden within the layers could turn an entire aircraft into a hazard. And too often, that flaw was invisible until the moment it killed. Test pilots, once the boldest voices in the Luftwaffe, grew wary. They had seen prototypes disintegrate midair, one moment slicing cleanly through the sky, the next erupting into splinters as the fuselage failed along a line no blueprint predicted. After witnessing these sudden disintegrations, many pilots spoke openly of their fears. A few quietly refused further flights, citing not cowardice but inevitability. No amount of skill could compensate for an airframe unwilling to stay whole. In an air war already defined by attrition, the Luftwaffe could not afford to lose its remaining veterans to structural failures. The broader context only deepened the crisis. Germany's resources were thinning to transparency. Aluminum was diverted to proven defensive fighters like the Bf-109 and Fw-190. Engines were prioritized for interceptor projects with immediate tangible returns. Skilled labor, already scarce, was drawn into emergency repairs, flak production, and the scramble to replace losses on every front. What little remained for experimental wooden aircraft was insufficient to sustain them. The Luftwaffe was fighting for survival. It no longer had the luxury of chasing technological shadows. By late 1944, the attempt to copy the Mosquito had drifted into symbolic territory. It no longer represented a practical program, but a hope, a belief that Germany could still match British innovation despite losing the material, industrial, and organizational foundations that made such innovation possible. The Mosquito had become more than a machine. It had become a reminder of everything Germany lacked. Each failed prototype emphasized this truth with quiet finality. And within engineering circles, a deeper understanding slowly formed. Innovation cannot exist in isolation. It depends on infrastructure, on skilled hands, on supply chains that function without interruption. Britain's carpenters, chemists, and craftsmen had built the Mosquito on a decade of accumulated knowledge. Germany, strained by war and fragmented by political interference, attempted to recreate that achievement in a fraction of the time and under relentless pressure. No system, however brilliant, can flourish in such conditions. By the time this realization settled, the wooden projects still on drawing boards were no longer seen as solutions, but as relics of ambitions Germany could no longer afford. The Mosquito had soared, Germany's counterparts had splintered, and the contrast revealed the widening gulf between two nations at war. And soon, as Allied bombers ranged deeper into the Reich with growing confidence, the question shifted from imitation to endurance. How much longer the Luftwaffe could remain in the fight at all? By 1944, the Luftwaffe faced a foe more implacable than any aircraft in the Allied arsenal. Time itself had turned against Germany. Every month, Allied production surged upward, more bombers, more fighters, more trained crews, while the Reich's capacity fell away piece by piece under the weight of relentless attack. Even before German engineers could complete a prototype or refine an adhesive formula, the industrial landscape around them shifted, shrank, or vanished in smoke. The race to counter the Mosquito no longer resembled a contest of design. It had become a struggle against a clock Germany could not stop. Meanwhile, the Mosquito evolved into something far greater than the fast bomber that had first startled German radar operators. It appeared in new forms, sleek photo reconnaissance aircraft that photographed targets with impunity, night fighters that hunted Luftwaffe bombers over their own territory, and intruder variants that struck airfields at the very moment German pilots attempted to take off. Each version expanded Britain's reach and compressed Germany's options. The aircraft's adaptability revealed its true strength. It was not merely fast, but versatile in ways no German counterpart could replicate under wartime pressure. Inside Germany, responses remained fragmented. Focke-Wulf pushed the Ta-154. Heinkel advocated the He-219. Junkers proposed wooden experiments of its own. Messerschmitt lobbied for metal designs instead. The Air Ministry, eyed by factional disputes and political interference, attempted to support all of them and ended up supporting none effectively. What Britain achieved through focused evolution, Germany approached through diffusion, each program drawing resources from the others, weakening the whole. Time widened this gap with brutal efficiency. Against this backdrop, the Ta-154 inched toward limited production. Early runs of fuselage molds were completed, jigs and Göring frames were assembled, the first set of airframes seemed nearly ready for deployment. For a moment there was a fragile sense of progress, but then the bombers returned. A single raid destroyed critical tooling, presses, templates, precision molds representing months of scarce labor. What survived was incomplete, what was lost could not be replaced. The program, which had already stretched the limits of German industry, was now effectively severed from its foundation. The aircraft intended to challenge the Mosquito encountered its decisive defeat not in the air, but on the factory floor. Desperation forced engineers to test replacement adhesives once again, searching for any compound that could withstand the strain of high-speed flight. But under laboratory heat cycles, bonds bubbled and separated. In wind tunnel tests, laminates peeled away as if shedding their own surface. Reports circulated describing catastrophic failures of primary load-bearing joints, clinical language masking a simple truth. The aircraft could not be trusted to stay together. Behind closed doors, engineers at Focke-Wulf and Junkers began to voice what none dared state publicly. The Mosquito's elegance, its combination of materials, craftsmanship, and chemistry, could not be reproduced in a nation fighting for survival under daily bombardment. Germany still possessed extraordinary technical talent, but talent alone could not replace factories reduced to rubble, supply chains shattered, or workshops stripped of their most skilled artisans. The Mosquito had been built in a country that had time to refine and perfect its methods. Germany had no such time left. This realization cast a long shadow over the Air Ministry. It seemed almost a paradox. Germany had created the world's first operational jet fighters. It had assembled ballistic missiles that pierced the upper atmosphere. It had pursued exotic weapons that reshaped the future of warfare. Yet it could not copy a wooden aircraft, precisely because the Mosquito's strength lay not in futuristic technology, but in stability, consistency, and an industrial calm the Reich no longer possessed. And as the Mosquito continued to range over German skies, untouched and uncatchable, a final question began to emerge. What would the collapse of time and industry mean for the Luftwaffe's remaining hopes, when even its simplest ambitions had begun to fail? By early 1945, the Luftwaffe was a force living on borrowed time. Fuel was scarce, pilots were scarce, and the sky above Germany had become a place the Reich no longer controlled. Yet Hermann Göring, clinging to the last symbols of technological salvation, made one final push. The Ta-154, battered by failures, weakened by shortages, and surrounded by rivals, was to be fielded as a night fighter at any cost. It was less a strategy than a gesture, an attempt to reclaim dignity in a war where dignity had become a luxury. The order was unmistakable: finish the aircraft, put it into service, prove that Germany could still match the Mosquito. Production lines, such as they were, lurched into motion. Airframes were assembled with whatever adhesives remained, many from batches engineers had already flagged as unstable. Quality control, once a point of pride, dissolved into a set of compromises. Workers labored under bombardment, often in facilities damaged only days earlier. Under these conditions, each Ta-154 that emerged from the assembly line carried within it the uncertainty of its own construction. Craftsmanship had given way to expedience, and expedience left its marks on every joint, every laminated curve, every stressed wooden spar. When flight tests resumed, the results were as uneven as the materials themselves. Some aircraft performed acceptably on takeoff, rising cleanly before revealing subtle vibrations at higher speeds, vibrations that signaled structural stresses no reinforcement could fully contain. Others shuddered from the moment their wheels left the runway. Test crews reported resonance through the fuselage, wing flexing under aerodynamic load, and panels that creaked at altitude like timbers in a storm. The engines, reliable in earlier prototypes, now suffered from maintenance shortages and fuel inconsistencies. Every pilot who entered the cockpit did so knowing that the machine beneath him was unproven, fragile, and in truth, unfinished. Those pilots, experienced and weary from years of attrition, offered quiet assessments. They preferred the He-219, the aircraft that had demonstrated ability, range, and firepower long before politics turned against it. Their reports were measured, technical, and consistent. But in the office corridors above them, those reports met resistance. Political interference had become the gravity through which every Luftwaffe program had to move. Göring did not want to hear that the Ta-154 was unsafe. He did not want to hear that the He-219 was the better machine. He wanted a German Mosquito. And so objections were softened, then ignored, then buried. Propaganda filled the gap. The Reich insisted that the Ta-154, once deployed, would stop the Mosquito intruders that struck airfields and factories with unsettling regularity. Newspapers spoke of a wooden night fighter ready to reclaim the darkness. But behind the rhetoric lay a stark truth. Not a single Ta-154 ever intercepted a Mosquito in combat. Those that flew did so only briefly, confined to training or limited testing. None reached operational squadrons. The sky remained unchanged, and the intruders continued their work with the same unbroken efficiency. The end came not through a dramatic failure in battle, but through something quieter and crueler. During a landing at a test field in the final months of the war, a Ta-154 prototype touched down normally before sliding into a series of vibrations. Witnesses saw the left wing fold with a sickening inevitability, the fuselage splintering as the aircraft scraped across the runway. The pilot escaped with injuries, but the meaning of the accident was unmistakable. The structure had failed under the most routine of stresses. There was nothing left to salvage. Afterward, the program received no formal cancellation, no public acknowledgement. It simply faded. Engineers were reassigned, resources diverted, documents filed away without ceremony. The Ta-154 died the way many wartime projects do, not in flames, but in silence. In a workshop littered with broken spars and delaminated panels, Germany's last attempt to rival the Mosquito ended not with triumph or even combat, but with the quiet of splintered wood and the realization that the race had been lost long before the aircraft ever left the ground. And in that silence, a final truth emerged, one the next section must confront. Germany's pursuit had always been aimed at a moving target, for the Mosquito was already evolving into something faster, stronger, and far beyond the reach of any imitation. By the winter of 1944, the darkness over Germany no longer belonged to the Luftwaffe. It belonged to a wooden aircraft that moved with such confidence, such precision, that entire regions began to feel its presence long before they ever saw it. The Mosquito, light, fast, and uncatchable, roamed through the night as if it had been designed specifically to exploit every weakness in Germany's defenses. And in many ways it had. Each intruder mission struck not the symbolic heart of the Reich, but the practical one: airfields, fuel depots, radar posts, and the fragile infrastructure that kept the Luftwaffe alive. The raids were small, sharp, and devastatingly effective. Where heavy bombers battered cities, the Mosquito crippled the Luftwaffe's ability to fight back at all. Night fighter crews, once considered the elite of German aviation, felt the shift immediately. Their radar screens flickered with contacts that vanished as quickly as they appeared. The Mosquito flew too low for consistent tracking, too fast for interception, and too quietly for detection until it was already overhead. Crews scrambled, climbed, and searched the darkness in widening circles, often returning without having seen a single enemy aircraft. Reports became painfully similar. Target unidentified, assumed Mosquito. To the men trained to dominate the night sky, the admission felt like defeat written in the language of procedure. Civilians, too, witnessed the aircraft's uncanny precision. Unlike the droning waves of heavy bombers that announced their approach with thunder, the Mosquito arrived almost unnoticed. Its engines, tuned for high performance rather than brute power, sounded like a distant hum until the moment bombs fell with unsettling accuracy. In cities where Allied raids had once come with sweeping destruction, the Mosquito delivered strikes that felt deliberate, directed at military targets with a clarity that separated them from the chaos of war. To many Germans, the contrast was unsettling. They saw in this wooden aircraft a kind of discipline the Reich claimed to embody but could no longer sustain. For Göring, each successful Mosquito raid carved deeper into an old wound. The Luftwaffe he had once shaped into a weapon of unprecedented reach was now powerless against a machine he had publicly mocked. His speeches grew sharper, angrier, filled with assurances that new systems, new weapons, new tactics were on the way. But his own officers no longer shared his confidence. They knew what he would not admit. Germany had no answer to the Mosquit. Oh, not in 1942, not in 1944, and certainly not now, when resources had dwindled to the point where even routine maintenance required improvisation. German air defense commanders articulated this truth with a clarity that left no room for optimism. The Mosquito outpaced their fighters, outmaneuvered their flak, and outlasted their radar networks. It could bomb, scout, intercept, and intrude, all with the same airframe. Its very existence mocked the complexity of German aviation doctrine. The Reich had built machines of extraordinary ambition, jets that broke speed barriers, rockets that touched the edge of space, prototypes that hinted at the future. Yet none of them could do what the Mosquito did every night: control the battlefield through reliability, adaptability, and design simplicity. In the final months of the war, the Mosquito became more than a weapon. It became a symbol of Allied mastery, a demonstration of what could be achieved when innovation aligned with industrial stability, disciplined engineering, and a willingness to defy tradition. While Germany chased marvels on drawing boards, Britain refined a machine already reshaping the conflict. The Mosquito's wooden frame, dismissed by its enemies as primitive, revealed itself as the quiet triumph of a philosophy Germany had lost long before the war began: that the most effective weapon is often the one that works every time. And so, as the Luftwaffe dwindled and the night sky changed hands, the wooden aircraft that Germany once laughed at came to define the air war more profoundly than the jets and rockets that filled Allied intelligence with alarm. What the Reich never understood was that the Mosquito's power did not lie in its material, but in the world that allowed such a machine to be built. A world whose next innovation was already rising beyond the horizon, ready to eclipse even the wooden phantom that owned the night. As Berlin burned in the final months of the war, the remnants of Germany's wooden aircraft ambitions lay scattered across ruined factories. Inside assembly halls where engineers once spoke in the hopeful language of prototypes and performance curves, unfinished Ta-154 fuselages rested in silence, some cracked by blast waves, others intact but forever grounded. The jigs that had once held their shapes were twisted or overturned. Sunlight filtered through shattered roofs, falling across frames that would never see the sky. It was a fitting end, not a battle, not a test flight, but abandonment. The dream of a German Mosquito had collapsed not at altitude, but here among the splinters. In this final chaos, engineers faced decisions that reflected both fear and resignation. Some destroyed technical documents before Soviet forces arrived, feeding blueprints and adhesive formulas into hastily lit fires. They believed that their work, however flawed, might be twisted into new purposes by the victors. Others made a different choice. They surrendered their knowledge willingly, offering insight into what had gone right and what had gone catastrophically wrong, in hopes that transparency might buy safety in a world reshaping itself by the hour. Their testimonies, quiet, weary, and unadorned, would later form the backbone of a clearer truth. Post-war interviews revealed not anger directed outward, but a deep bitterness inward. Many engineers admitted they had known from the early stages that Germany could never truly match the Mosquito. Some had recognized the adhesive shortages as fatal years before the program's end. Others understood that the fragmented industrial landscape, fractured by politics and bomb damage, made consistency impossible. A few confessed an admiration for the British achievement, knowing that such elegance was not a matter of copying dimensions, but recreating an entire ecosystem, one Germany no longer possessed. Their bitterness was not born from failure alone, but from the realization that the failure had been inevitable. When Allied technical officers finally inspected the remains of German wooden aircraft projects, they found something surprising. The Ta-154's aerodynamic design was sound. Its systems were reasonable for their intended role. The ingenuity of German engineers was not in question. The root cause of collapse lay elsewhere, in materials science that Germany could not replicate, and in the industrial stability required to support it. The Mosquito was not simply a fast aircraft. It was the physical expression of a British mastery of adhesives, laminates, and distributed manufacturing. Where German resins failed, British resins held. Where German laminates warped, British laminates retained perfect curvature. The difference was not in drafting tables, but in chemistry and supply chains. This revelation changed how the Mosquito was studied in the years after the war. It became less a story about aerodynamics and more a case study in industrial philosophy. The aircraft demonstrated that innovation does not emerge solely from radical technology, but from synergy between material science, craftsmanship, logistics, and design. In the Mosquito, all of these aligned. In the Ta-154, none of them did. Future aviation planners drew lessons from this quiet contrast, recognizing that an elegant blueprint is meaningless without the infrastructure to bring it to life. For the Luftwaffe, the collapse of the Ta-154 project symbolized the collapse of an entire doctrine. German strategy had long equated superiority with metal, engines, and complexity. Speed was to be achieved through advanced metallurgy, not through lightweight construction. Strength was measured by thickness of armor, not by the absence of it. The Mosquito revealed the limits of this thinking. It proved that simplicity, when supported by expertise and industry, could outperform even the most sophisticated machinery. The Luftwaffe's inflexibility, its inability to adapt its doctrine to the demands of total war, had left it vulnerable to a weapon it never took seriously until it was too late. And so, in the ruins of Berlin, between abandoned fuselages and scattered engineering documents, the true turning point became clear. This was never just a story of two aircraft competing for superiority. It was a story of two nations shaped by different philosophies, one embracing flexibility and distributed innovation, the other trapped in its own grandeur. The Mosquito's triumph was not only aerodynamic, it was industrial, cultural, and conceptual. And just beyond this moment, another transformation waited. The era in which even wood would give way to an entirely new material, ushering aviation into a future neither side had fully imagined. When the war ended and the skies of Europe fell silent, aviation historians turned their attention to a question that had haunted Germany's engineers for years. Why had the Reich failed to match a wooden aircraft? The answer, as they pieced it together, was not a single flaw, but a constellation of them. Materials that could not endure stress, political rivalries that sabotaged cooperation, timing that left no room for refinement, and a strategic arrogance that dismissed wood as obsolete long after it had proven otherwise. In the Ta-154 program, each of these weaknesses compounded the others, revealing a truth that wartime urgency had obscured. No aircraft, however clever on paper, can rise above the industrial and cultural systems that birth it. The Mosquito, by contrast, became a quiet architect of post-war design philosophy. It demonstrated that strength could come from lightness rather than armor, and that a single airframe, if engineered with foresight, could excel in multiple roles. Fighter, bomber, reconnaissance platform, pathfinder. The Mosquito shifted effortlessly between them, showing a versatility that challenged assumptions about what combat aircraft must be. Post-war designers studied its form like scripture. They saw in its construction the early seeds of concepts that would later define jet-age thinking: modularity, adaptability, and the careful balancing of structural efficiency against mission demands. It was not merely a wartime marvel, it was a blueprint for the future. Many former German engineers spoke with surprising candor when interviewed in the decades that followed. Some admitted an admiration they could never have voiced during the war. They marveled at the British achievement, not because the Mosquito was exotic, but because its elegance lay in decisions Germany never took seriously. A laminated plywood structure that resisted warping, a glue that held through extremes of temperature, a manufacturing base that drew upon artisans as readily as machinists. These were not technological miracles, but thoughtful integrations of science and craft. The engineers' respect came not from defeat, but from recognition of a masterpiece built outside their own reach. And so the Ta-154, once promoted as Germany's mosquito killer, found new life as a cautionary tale in design schools. Students studying aircraft failures learned that brilliance in aerodynamics cannot compensate for instability in materials. They learned that a program built on political pressure rather than engineering readiness is fated to fracture. The Ta-154's downfall showed that even the most promising prototypes are doomed when the manufacturing environment cannot support consistent quality. In the quiet, reflective halls of post-war academia, the aircraft taught lessons more enduring than any sortie it might have flown. Across the Channel, Britain celebrated the Mosquito not with triumphalism, but with a sense of gratitude. The aircraft had carried the nation through some of its darkest moments. It had photographed targets no other aircraft could reach, guided bomber streams through enemy defenses, and struck Gestapo headquarters with precision that spared civilians whenever possible. To the British public, the Mosquito became not just a weapon, but a symbol of ingenuity in adversity, a reminder that wartime innovation often emerges from unlikely materials and unorthodox ideas. The wooden plane had earned its place in history not by brute force, but by clarity of purpose. Its impact, however, extended far beyond reputation. The Mosquito accelerated Allied reconnaissance to a degree that reshaped the ground war. Its fast surveys mapped enemy positions with unmatched detail. Its intruder missions crippled German logistics, targeting transport hubs and airfields with precision raids that eroded the Reich's ability to coordinate defenses. In a conflict often measured in mass and firepower, the Mosquito offered a different kind of victory, one defined by agility, intelligence, and timing. Each mission, each photograph, each carefully placed bomb formed part of a broader transformation in how air power shaped events on the ground. From these threads emerges a final consequence. The fate of nations, historians concluded, does not hinge solely on grand strategies or monumental weapons. It also rests on the smallest decisions, on the selection of adhesives, the training of craftspeople, the quiet confidence to trust materials others overlook. The Mosquito embodied this truth. The Ta-154 exposed it. And together they revealed that in war, as in design, greatness is often found not in what is added, but in what is understood. And yet the story is not finished, for the world that emerged from these lessons was preparing to embrace a material that would push aviation past wood, past metal, and into an entirely new era. In the years leading up to the war, Germany celebrated its mastery of high technology with a fervor that bordered on mythology. Jets, rockets, precision-machined fighters, these were the machines that symbolized the Reich's vision of modernity. Anything less was dismissed as an artifact of a previous age. And so, when Britain unveiled a wooden aircraft, many in the German high command saw not innovation, but irrelevance. They could not imagine that a material associated with workshops and carpenters would one day outpace the best metal aircraft their factories could produce. In their reverence for the extraordinary, they overlooked the quiet disciplines that made the Mosquito possible: chemistry, craftsmanship, adaptability, and the humility to embrace simplicity. But the war would expose a universal principle that no doctrine, however rigid, could escape. Innovation thrives where minds are free, industries flexible, and leadership willing to listen. Britain had built an aviation ecosystem that welcomed contributions from violin makers, boat builders, furniture craftsmen, and chemical engineers. The Mosquito emerged not from a single genius or a single factory, but from a network of skills cultivated across decades. Its success was the triumph of a culture that valued integration over prestige. Germany, by contrast, narrowed its focus to the spectacular, believing that complexity alone conferred superiority. In that belief, it lost the ability to see the power of the ordinary. Göring's jealousy became the most recognizable symbol of this blindness. He mocked the Mosquito in public, yet envied it in private. His outburst, "I turn green with envy," echoed far beyond the walls of his command offices. It revealed the insecurity at the heart of a system that equated national pride with technological grandeur. The Mosquito did not fit that worldview. It was not loud or heavy or intimidating. It did not rely on rare metals or revolutionary engines. It simply worked, reliably, repeatedly, and devastatingly. And in doing so, it exposed how pride had eroded the Reich's ability to evaluate ideas on their merit rather than their appearance. For aviation historians, the Mosquito stands as one of the clearest examples of elegant simplicity outperforming brute force engineering. Its design philosophy rejected excess. Every component served multiple purposes. Every curve supported airflow. Every material choice reflected an understanding that efficiency is not the enemy of strength, but its partner. The aircraft's extraordinary speed and versatility were not accidents. They were the result of a deliberate rejection of unnecessary complexity. Where the Reich prized the dramatic, the Mosquito embodied restraint. Where Germany sought dominance through escalation, the Mosquito achieved mastery through clarity. Modern air forces continue to study the aircraft not only as a relic of wartime innovation, but as a lesson in design thinking. Its efficiency of structure, its economy of resources, and its adaptability across missions reveal a logic that transcends its era. The Mosquito demonstrated that the future of aviation would not be shaped solely by advances in materials or propulsion, but by the ability to match form to function with precision. Its influence can be traced through generations of multi-role aircraft, each inheriting the same principle. That versatility begins with thoughtful simplicity. Germany's failure to copy the Mosquito became, in hindsight, a deeper failure, one of understanding the nature of innovation itself. Imitation required more than measurements. It required a cultural shift Germany was unwilling or unable to make. The Reich tried to reproduce a machine without reproducing the values that created it. In choosing complexity over adaptability, prestige over practicality, and hierarchy over open collaboration, it sealed the fate of every wooden project it attempted. And so the story curves toward its final reflection. Victory, history reminds us, does not always belong to the louder, the larger, or the more technologically dazzling. Sometimes it belongs to those who see possibility in modest materials, who trust craftsmanship as much as theory, and who understand that a simple idea, executed flawlessly, can outrun the grandest vision built on pride. What Germany failed to see in the Mosquito would soon become impossible to ignore, especially as the final chapter reveals how this wooden aircraft reshaped not only a war, but the philosophy of air power itself. In the long quiet of peacetime, when the smoke of battle had lifted and the urgency of survival had faded into memory, veterans on both sides began to speak more freely of the machines that had shaped their lives. Among RAF crews, the Mosquito was not remembered as a miracle of engineering so much as a triumph of craftsmanship, an aircraft that reflected the hands that built it. Pilots spoke of its responsiveness, its steadiness, its uncanny ability to turn every mission into a negotiation of speed and precision rather than brute force. They recalled maintenance crews who patched plywood as carefully as they once repaired furniture, and artisans whose wartime contributions were written not in steel, but in layered sheets of birch and balsa. To those who flew it, the Mosquito was never simply a weapon. It was a companion, light, loyal, and impossibly fast. Former Luftwaffe officers, interviewed decades after the war, admitted something rarely voiced in combat reports. If any Allied aircraft frightened them, it was the wooden ghost. Night fighter veterans described the frustration of radar contacts that dissolved into static, of shadows crossing the moonlit sky too swiftly for pursuit, of engines that hummed just below the threshold of certainty. They spoke of airfields attacked the moment their own fighters lifted off, of reconnaissance missions that seemed impossible to intercept, and of the demoralizing knowledge that somewhere above them flew an aircraft they could neither match nor understand. The Mosquito, they admitted, was feared not because it was invulnerable, but because it refused to behave as aircraft were expected to behave. Historians, revisiting the period, often return to Göring's bitter remark, "I turn green with envy," as a symbolic turning point. What began as a jealous outburst came to be seen as reluctant respect, even as an unintentional epitaph for Germany's wartime aviation doctrine. His envy captured the irony of a nation that embraced the extraordinary, jets, rockets, impossible weapons, yet stumbled over the most unassuming of adversaries, a wooden plane built in workshops scattered across the British countryside. The Mosquito challenged everything the Reich believed about progress, exposing how innovation can emerge from places overlooked by those who mistake complexity for superiority. In contrast, the Ta-154 slipped quietly into obscurity. Without combat records, without a legacy of missions flown, it survived only in museum fragments and footnotes of engineering studies. It became a reminder not of what Germany built, but of what it could not build. Where the Mosquito embodied the union of design and industry, the Ta-154 revealed the cost of misalignment. Brilliance constrained by scarcity, ambition undone by instability, potential suffocated by the conditions of its creation. Students of aviation came to view it not with ridicule, but with a kind of solemn respect for the engineers who had attempted the impossible with tools unfit for the task. As decades passed, the Mosquito grew into a legend. Airshows restored it. Museums enshrined it. Enthusiasts celebrated its achievements with a reverence usually reserved for aircraft made of polished metal. But it was precisely its wooden nature that elevated it, proof that innovation often thrives apart from conventional wisdom. It had accelerated Allied reconnaissance, disrupted German logistics, and reshaped the very architecture of aerial warfare. Yet its greatest accomplishment was quieter. It reminded the world that ingenuity is not measured by the glamour of a material, but by the imagination that transforms that material into purpose. From these reflections emerges the final moral of the story. The war was filled with machines that dazzled the eye, rockets that pierced the stratosphere, jets that broke speed barriers, superweapons meant to alter the course of history. But the aircraft that left one of the deepest marks was made of plywood, glue, and the steady confidence of those who believed in an idea others found laughable. Strength, the Mosquito proved, lies not in the material, but in the mind that shapes it. They mocked the wooden plane once. They never mocked it again.